So this first example is clear-cut one of the bishop being a bad bishop. I think we can say that already now. There's not really anything, there's no coming back for this bishop really in this position. But that is also down to, let's say you have a goalkeeper in a position where you are very passive. So white has the two rooks on the open file and also this huge knight on e5. So this is more like a team playing parking the bus in front of their own goal. There's no really activity going forward. So in such a case, it's easy to point at the bishop and say it's bad, but overall, black has a position problem here. That was the way black played in this position. He allowed himself to get into this very passive position. So in that sense, it's not really knight versus bishop. It's more like white is active with the rooks as well. So every time black tries to move the pawn forward, white can just keep it closed. And in the game, as you maybe remember, something like this happened. The king eventually went to e5, and this bishop is totally helpless, nothing to attack. And knight to f6. And you've probably seen the end of this game before, but let's just white to move and win. Okay, I will just show the winning idea is rook takes g7 and king e5, and that rook is trapped on f6. If black tries to save this rook with either of the rooks to f8, then he's getting mated. So he simply resigned after king e5. But that last part of the game, that was actually the least interesting, because white, from the diagram, from the puzzle you saw, it was completely winning for white. Okay, so bad bishop on a6 and bad position for black. So that was probably the most clear-cut example in these puzzles. So here we have another famous example, Reshevsky against Petrosyan, where Petrosyan makes his famous exchange sacrifice with rook e6. So, what about this one? What do you think? What can we say about this bishop, and how to make sense of this move, rook e6? So I've taken a few famous examples in the puzzles, because if I can use my, let's say, my double-edged bishop logic on the famous example and it works, then that's a pretty good proof, so to speak. So we will do exchange sacrifice in a later class, as I said, but exchange sacrifices are linked to the double-edged bishops, and I do spend one chapter in the book on exchange sacrifices. So you can make an exchange, an even trade of pieces, and then try to isolate the double-edged bishop, let's say the bishop on b2. But that trade could also be an exchange sacrifice, which is still a trade, rook for bishop. So you're still isolating that double-edged bishop. Does a rook e6 strengthen the g6 bishop? So that's a very good question. So let's just take the continuation. So let's see what happens with this bishop, because that is also a double bishop, meaning that this bishop is not really attacking anything. But this bishop becomes strong in cooperation with the other pieces. This knight is jumping to d5, and then suddenly the bishop in cooperation with the other pieces. So we have seen other positions where if this position is totally alone, then it might be a problem because it's not attacking anything. But you could say in a position like this, let's say this was the game, and the knight jumped to d5. You could say that the bishop was strengthened in the sense that now there's more light squared control, and so the position we got out of this here, because black has very active play and because this has been isolated, if black gets the initiative, I think we have strengthened this bishop on g6. But it's still a double-edged bishop, and it still depends on the other pieces. So I would say without this move a4 for white, I think black is better. But Rashevsky was a strong player too, so he played it early on. I would say if white hesitates a little bit and doesn't play a4 here, then let's say something like this, just to give a move, something like this, and then like in the game, I don't know. I think white could be in real trouble here, because if we're looking at concrete targets, then this bishop is isolated. This bishop is maybe doing a great job defending, and also on this open diagonal, the knight is attacking all these weaknesses. Black has a clear plan of creating a passed pawn. Maybe we can play something like queen c6 first to make sure we don't drop this pawn. So in this position, black would have all the play. And if you have an initiative going and you're trying to create a passed pawn over here, then we're suddenly looking at this bishop as being a strong bishop. So you could also see that, say this is an extension of the opposite colored bishops, but I think if white ended up something like this, and this bishop on b2 looks, with black having the initiative, this bishop on b2 looks like a bad bishop for sure, even though it does do some defending. But that's more to do with white's overall position being he's on the back foot because black is doing the attacking. So the bishop on g6 is still, it's not attacking anything concrete, it's just helping the other pieces. But Rashevsky, he played a4, and then he took here, and now, yeah, now it happened like this. And now he's undermining c4, that's why he played queen f1. And then the game fizzled out something like this. White sacrificed back the exchange, and then we got to, there was still a little bit sharp this endgame, but it ended in a draw, something like this. So white is a pawn up, but this huge knight compensates for sure. So that's another thing that can happen. Let's say if you want to try to isolate this bishop, sometimes you can even sacrifice a pawn, because you know that. So pawn sacrifices, exchange sacrifice, these things can happen if the opponent, let's say white here has a double-edged bishop that could be isolated into a bad bishop. So that gives some room for sacrifices, even pawn sacrifices like this. So got into this, and I think they agreed to a draw here. So they probably went home and analyzed, and then took a draw from there. Okay, let's move on. What do we got here? Yeah, this is a question to that open line we had earlier. Because Chianin, he came up with this move bishop b4. And then this continuation for black. So what is the point of moving that bishop out there and taking c3? What could be the point of that? So if you just followed, let's say, normal logic of, common sense logic, whatever you call it, a straightforward logic, you would say, oh, this is my problem piece. So definitely I want to keep this bishop on the board. That could be like, let's say, simple logic about the position. And then black suddenly goes out here and exchanges that bishop and then goes bishop e6. This is actually quite a safe position for black. I believe it's just equal and very easy to play for black. So what's the whole idea of this bishop b4 takes c3? And there's a very short answer to that. You're welcome to chip in the chat. So black's logic is simply, okay, I will isolate your double-edged bishop a little bit more. I know that I isolate my own, but okay, so we both isolate our bishops, but yeah. So I would say simply we are isolating the double-edged bishop, but both parties does that, so it's okay. Nothing really changed. So black will now try to do something on the dark squares. I think in the game he plays a5 and h6. And this knight on c6 is actually doing a great job trying to defend the dark squares. The queen will go to e7. So black is very focused on trying to control the dark squares now that he has this light square bishop on e6. So talking about the knights, let's continue a little bit with this position. B takes c3 is actually, if white wants to keep a little bit alive in this position, he should go b takes c3. And so the idea is a little bit to take a little bit of a weakness there, but strengthen the center. And then the main idea is try to get the rook to g3, where it would still defend this c3, and then try to attack g7, try to create some weaknesses. So getting the rook to g3 is a pretty good idea. I also have this line in my book, b takes c3, but that is definitely a better winning try, because this is very much a simplified position. There is still a good, so there was a question about the knights. So this knight still needs some relocating. Might not be so strong on f3. So let's see this game played by Chernin, where he drew fairly easily against another Russian or Soviet grandmaster. If I get the game. Oh, I don't have the game here. So I will put that game in the database when I send it out. But basically, they exchanged most of the pieces except for this knight, this bishop, and then they had a rook each. And then because of this additional rook on the board, and white had weaknesses on the dark squares, just because this one additional rook, white was not safe, and white couldn't really get the knight around because d4 and f2 were weaknesses that could be attacked. If we exchange all the pieces in the position, I think we are in for a very good endgame for white with knight versus bishop. So especially if the white king gets to c5 in such an endgame. Everything exchanged. So so there was still one extra additional piece was enough to make life easy for black. Yeah. So I cut off the game here, but I will put it in the database I send out. So let's move on from this position. Number 4. And this is another famous game, but winning against Capablanca. And this move c4 is a strategic error because now white gets a free hand in the center. So Capablanca's idea was to go here, and then this pawn is a weakness. So he's simply going for that a4 pawn. So my question here was, what about this bishop on b2? So in these Ragozin Nimzo Indian structures, it's always the bishop on c1 or the dark squared bishop that is a double-edged bishop. So so what is white's main plan in this position? And you can let me know if, yeah, Matthew, you're absolutely correct. You can let me know if you've seen this game before, just briefly. This is, of course, a very famous move, so you've probably seen it before. So I can just, yeah, that's exactly right. So that is actually the 4 next move for white. We are going to play e4. And then we need to prepare it. e3 is hanging. So we need to get the rook to e1. So this is exactly what happens. Yeah. And Capablanca was greedy, took that pawn. That was the whole plan. And now he has some ideas of knight takes d4. No, knight c5, sorry. Actually trying to exchange queens or bring the knight back into d3, knight c5. Because white doesn't want to exchange queens because white is about to build up an attack against the black king. So he plays queen f2 first, and then he starts rolling his pawns. So white's initiative is stronger than the pawn. So black is desperately trying to exchange as many pieces as possible. And one reason why this game is beautiful is that black is exchanging a lot of pieces, but white wins with the bare minimum, which is a queen and a pawn. Queen and 1 extra piece is enough to win that game. And it turns out that knight is stuck over here. So even though black ends up being a piece up, he cannot really, that knight is far away and of no use to the defense on the other side. So, and here comes the famous move in this game, which shows that that double-edged bishop was definitely not bad because, well, it still had a function. So bishop a3 is the move he played. Black took, and now we have this sequence. This knight is pinned on f6. So check, and now white will get the knight with a check. And this is winning if we can just avoid a lot of checks here. So this is what white is doing. He's just running up the board and playing g4, and black ran out of checks at this point and resigned the game. So there's nothing to do against the idea of queen f8. Bishop c1 when? Earlier in the game? Right now there's a knight there on b3. So it's not possible to play bishop c1. Now, the bishop a3 was a brilliant idea. So the knight did have a function. It prevents bishop c1. Okay. So again, the bishop was still, because there was still pieces left on the board. That's why bishop a3 works. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. Okay, let's go for the next one. This is a Carlsen game. And let's forward. So Carlsen ends up exchanging queens and sacrificing an exchange. And we get to this position. Got you. So this position, here we have the bishop on e3, which is frankly not doing a lot. Same square as the pawns there, so it doesn't look like a greatest bishop. So this is an example of exchanging that double-edged bishop to break through. So Carlsen in the game, he played a3. And then he actually started an attack with bishop, knight, and rook, which was pretty strong. He got his rook to the second rank, something like this. And then white's passed pawn here is far away, and when it starts going off the board, black's bishop is not only attacking over here, but it's actually controlling the promotion square. So this was a nice idea of Carlsen, and he won the game after a3. But there is this idea of also just taking out that bishop simply because we want to go to the f2 square. So that's a case of, otherwise, why would you exchange this beautiful knight against this bishop that seems to be doing nothing? And so you could argue that the reason why black is willing to take that bishop out for a breakthrough, then maybe the bishop wasn't so bad at all. So you could also argue it does do some defending. So it's just an interesting idea that often when a breakthrough happens, it happens on this so-called bad bishop, the double-edged bishop there. So it happens quite a lot, actually. So this is a nice idea. And then black can simply keep playing this position because white is unable to exchange pieces. It's not really realistic that white will get some counterplay against c7. He tries to organize the rooks to do that, then he'll probably get mated or the pawn will promote. So so we have quite the mating force here, actually, if the white rooks go away. And then white can improve the position with a pawn or bring the king forward. So black is in total control here, probably has a winning position at this point. So that would have been another solution to the problem. Simply take that bishop to get to f2 with the rook. So that was a point. Okay, I'm losing track of time a little bit. Let's move forward. So this is a classical example of, so what did you think about this one? So bishop c8 doesn't look too great. What about the overall evaluation of the position? I mean, if you had this position and you asked people to place the bishop on the worst possible square, they would probably pick c8. So black is actually okay here. And what makes black okay in this position? Black is actually fine. The game should have been a draw, but it was a blindfold game, and Gelfand with black, he missed a tactic in a blindfold game that a capture was check. So that's why he lost to the game. So it's a good idea to look at concrete targets. And we have the 2 pawns here. which can be defended by the bishop, our goalkeeper. And then in white's position, we have b4 and d4 as possible targets. And since black's rooks and queen is lined up against these two pawns, black uses queen and 2 rooks to get counterplay, and then it's okay to have this bishop that just, there to defend. So so that is the reason why black is okay here. So in the game, something like this happened. Probably black doesn't have more than this. So bishop d7 it's probably just a balanced position. So, but in this position, black decided to go for f5 simply because he will win the d4 pawn now. So it became very sharp now, something like this. And so we got to this position, and this is still very even. And this is where Gelfand missed that queen takes c4 is check. Maybe he missed that this pawn was no longer on f7. This was a blindfold game, so then he resigned. Queen takes c4 check, and then white is a rook up. Okay. So let's see this one. Some of you might remember I also used this for the book presentation, but I really like this example. So on the surface, it looks like this is black's bad bishop. But this is actually black's goalkeeper, because let's say the most obvious weakness in black's position, maybe even the only one, the only real weakness is d6. So this bishop has a nice function. Maybe later black can break the king in, and then he can play with the rest of the pieces. Bishop, knight, 2 rooks, and he has something going on the queen side. So it's okay to have one bishop on b7. It's just standing there. And this is an example of a breakthrough that happens by exchanging that bishop. So it's another example of an exchange sacrifice based on the double-edged bishops. So, but if black plays it now, if white takes on d6 now, then black can play something like this. And then white has to exchange his last rook. So whenever you sacrifice an exchange, it's nice if you can keep that last rook on the board, because the rook is so good at coordinating the minor pieces. The rook can control both colors at the same time. So the rook is excellent at coordinating a minor piece. So if you sacrifice an exchange, you want to keep that second rook in many cases. So it's still fairly promising for white here, but not so clear as in the game. So in the game, white had this idea, but he prepared it with taking that pawn. And now the idea is simply to get a grip like this. And then a5 pawn would be strong, and d6 would definitely be weak. So black goes for that a pawn. And now we sacrifice on d6 because this bishop is attacked. And in this position, this happened. He went into this endgame. Black is trying to exchange that last rook, and then rook d5 makes it very unappealing for black to take that rook, because that would just give 2 passed pawns here. So white just went on to win this game comfortably. Just moving slowly forward like this. And here black went into desperate mode, sacrificing the exchange, but white had an extra pawn and won the game. So this is a nice move, because these are the possible targets, and now white also get the rooks behind the passed pawn. So something like this, and black resigned. So again, white broke through on d6 and exchanging that bishop on e7. So again, you could argue if white was willing to do that, sacrifice an exchange on that bishop just to break through, then maybe that bishop was not that bad at all. So it definitely had a function. So it's a little bit of a paradox that the bishop that seems the worst for your opponent, you're actually willing to exchange that to break through. But it does happen a lot. So let's take the last one. We might go 5 minutes extra here. While I was working on the book, I saw a couple of examples of where it was possible to sacrifice that double S bishop. So in here, white really goes for the win here. So white actually ends up sacrificing a pawn to get to this position here. The queen b1. So white has sacrificed a pawn now because he wants to attack, and it does look not too great, that bishop on b7. But white has sacrificed a pawn, and his king is open. And so white definitely has threats. We have two targets here, and the rook there, and then the knight can jump in. That looks like a strong attack for white. So the solution here is to sacrifice that bishop on b7, simply to win time or whatever, but also because white's king is open, and there we have a target on c3. If this pawn drops, then this could become a dangerous passed pawn, and d4 could also become weak. So the solution is simply to get rid of the rooks, sacrifice the bishop, and then get a lot of counterplay. So this is a case of we can sacrifice that bishop on b7 instead of trying to hang on to it, and then we get something else. And this position is about equal. Black has so much counterplay that I think the engine suggests that the white simply takes a perpetual around here. So I would say this is one of the rare cases where you sacrifice that so-called bad bishop, double S bishops. But in order to get to that bad bishop or double S bishop on b7, then white had to make some concession as well, sacrifice a pawn, get an open king. So, and then black could use that to his advantage. So, okay, so a little bit of a special case at the end. That was it for today. Do you have any final questions or comments? There was a lot of evaluating in the puzzles. So I will send out an email with the database, and then I will also ask you about the class. Yep. So you can just give some comments there if you want. All right. See you next time.